Welcome to episode 126 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about the debut album by the American band Montrose from 1973, which was issued on Warner Brothers Records. Montrose are sometimes referred to as America's answer to Led Zeppelin. Not really a fair comparison because Zeppelin were a lot more multi-dimensional than these guys. These guys basically have one dimension, but it's a great dimension, and that dimension is balls out, undiluted hard rock, overdriven guitars, bass, drums, wailing vocals. That's basically what you're going to get here, and it's pretty damn good. So what I have here is the first UK pressing of this record, with Bill Church and Denny Carmassi on bass and drums respectively, the rhythm section, Ronnie Montrose on guitar, and Sammy Hagar, or as he was known then, Sam Hagar, on vocals. Of course, the sound and the impact of this band has an enormous amount to do with its founding member, guitarist Ronnie Montrose. Montrose was born in San Francisco. He grew up in Denver, and in the mid-1960s, he ran away to San Francisco, around 16 years of age, to pursue his musical career. By 1969, he'd formed a band called Sawbuck, which included Bill Church on bass, and they were signed to Fillmore Records, which was co-owned by Bill Graham, the famous promoter on the West Coast, and the producer David Rubinson. Rubinson had managed Moby Grape, and he was also managing Herbie Hancock. At that time, Herbie Hancock was in his Mwandishi phase, and through the connection with David Rubinson, who was managing both acts, Montrose ends up being able to do some session work on the Mwandishi album. In 1971, Sawbuck were recording their first album, but Rubinson knew that in Montrose he had a pretty rare talent, and that maybe there was room for greater ambition. The Irish singer Van Morrison had recently moved to California from Ireland, and he was looking for a new band to record his forthcoming album, Tupelo Honey, and Rubinson was involved in that. So Rubinson arranges an audition for Montrose with Van Morrison. The audition goes well, and not just Montrose, but also Church both leave Sawbuck to join Morrison. And that's where other paths cross, because Ted Templeman, ultimately the producer of this album, the Montrose debut, was also playing on the Tupelo Honey sessions, and that's where he and Montrose got to know each other, and where Templeman first formed his impression of Montrose as a guitarist. News about Montrose's technical ability continues to spread. He keeps getting more session work. He does a bit of work with Boz Scaggs, and then notably he does some work with the Edgar Winter Group, playing on Winter's famous album They Only Come Out at Night, which of course contained his greatest hit, Frankenstein. Sammy Hagar is a California kid, and he was born to a poor agricultural family in Salinas. He had what could only be described as a shitty upbringing. His dad was a World War II vet, had PTSD from that, drank heavily, used to beat the family, beat his wife, beat his children. They moved frequently, and eventually Sammy's mom decides she's had enough, and when Sammy was 10, she leaves his dad. Sammy survives all this. He perseveres through what must have been a pretty difficult time as a teenager, ends up playing in his high school years in a lot of bands in the Riverside, California area. Gets married after high school, sticks to music, and moves to San Francisco with his band, where almost immediately some of his band members are busted for drugs. The band splits up. He's broke. He's in big trouble, and he ends up having to move to New York to work for his father-in-law's trucking company, where he drove a dump truck for a number of months. In 1970, he moves back to Southern California. He has a vision about being abducted by aliens, so he does what I guess you would normally do if you had a vision like that, which was to go and consult a psychic. And the psychic says, Sam, if you move to San Francisco, good things are happening. Something is waiting to break for you. So he takes that advice and he moves back to San Francisco a couple of years after leaving with his family. And while singing in a cover band there, he's discovered by Ronnie Montrose, who recruits him to join his own eponymous band. In 1973, on the heels of all the success with the Edgar Winter Group, Ronnie Montrose had been given his own contract with Warner Brothers Records and needed to assemble a band. And in kind of a similar move to Jimmy Page when founding Zeppelin a few years earlier, he picks one studio vet in the form of Bill Church, with whom he'd played with Sawbuck and other bands, and two relative unknowns, Hagar and Carmassi, who had known each other playing cover bands. The lineup of Montrose, Hagar, Church, and Carmassi first gigs together in April 1973. Recalling that Church and Montrose both knew Ted Templeman, who by 1973 was a relatively well-established A&R guy with Warner's, having discovered the Doobie Brothers, Templeman's star was totally on the rise as a talent spotter with his label, and it was on his recommendation that Ronnie had gotten the contract with Warner's. He heard their demos, saw them gig, and brought them into the studio in the summer of 1973. Montrose's debut was produced by Templeman himself and was recorded in two different studios, Sunset Sound in Hollywood and Wally Heider Studios in San Francisco. The songs on here are all originals with one exception, Good Rockin' Tonight, which is the old jump blues song by Roy Brown, which Elvis had covered in the mid-1950s. Of the originals, Montrose had done most of the writing, but Hagar does come into the band with two songs which actually make a significant contribution. Make It Last, which is a closer, and of course Bad Motor Scooter, which is one of the signature songs of the record. What's clear when you listen to this record isn't just that Ted Templeman was a great spotter of talent, but he was also really burgeoning as a producer of music, because this record sounds remarkable for an album recorded in 1973. The soundstage is great. It's very simple, like a lot of Templeman's work. It really just lets the instruments speak for themselves. And what it shows, too, this particular technique, is how technically proficient Ronnie Montrose was a guitarist. He's using feedback, he's using harmonics, he's using all kinds of different lead techniques that were quite rare at the time, and of course ended up influencing another future act managed by Templeman, the Van Halens. The recording sessions apparently were quite unstructured. There was a lot of goofing around in the studio. They basically recorded at maximum volume and had to deal with all kinds of noise complaints while they were doing this. All four of the members were hard rock fans. They had a lot of similar influences, and at least one of these songs came from goofing around with Zeppelin-like sounds, where Carmassi starts laying down this big monster drum beat, like when the levee breaks, and that turns into Rock Candy. Other influences come from domestic sources like MC5, but there really is a distinct sound being carved out here, which is distinct from the big English bands of the day, but also distinct from the heavier bands in the United States at the time, people like Aerosmith and so on. This album ends up being very influential in the way that Van Halen would sound, and I would argue too on some of the new wave of heavy metal in the late 70s and early 80s. There's a lot of breadcrumbs that you can trace back to this record. Side one starts with Rock the Nation, one of the big songs in the record, and Ronnie's heavy riffing style is immediately apparent, so satisfying. I think this song, and this is kind of a comment that I would make for much of this record, would be stronger with a better vocal melody. There's nothing wrong technically with Hagar singing. He's really in the top rank of hard rock screamers, if you want to consider that a category, with people like Plant and Gillan and so on. But musically, I don't think his vocal melodies measure up to some of those other singers. However, that shouldn't take away from the general conclusion, which is that this song kicks ass, and it's very clear that this band is here to kick your ass when you put the needle in the groove. The next song is Bad Motor Scooter, which, as I mentioned, is one of the two songs which Sammy brings to the band. And this song famously starts with Ronnie mimicking the sound of a revving engine with a slide in his guitar. The riffing is great going forward, the ass kicking continues. Ronnie's solo is fantastic. This is just a great American rock song. The third song on side one is Space Station Number 5, which is one of the only songs to have anything like effects on it. The band here is totally killing it. The rhythm section is completely tight, and speaking of rhythm, Ronnie is showing what a great rhythm player he is, as well as a lead player. The bridge on this song is super cool. Again, the singing lacks a little bit of melody, but when the whole band kicks back into the main riff, there's nothing but adrenaline in this song. Final song is I Don't Want It, which is a rebellion against something. The lyrics don't quite make clear what. This is maybe the weakest of the four songs on side one, but Ronnie's guitar pulls it out of the bag. His riffing is incredible. His tone is a total revelation. Side two starts with the only cover, which is Good Rockin' Tonight, which is kind of a strange choice. Why they felt the need to introduce a song which was not really of a piece with everything else in the record. This is not hard rock / proto heavy metal. It's basically boogie rock. This is probably the weakest point in the record, even though it has what I think is Sammy's best vocal contribution. Now we're on to a song I mentioned before, which is Rock Candy. This is the one which came with goofing around with the When the Levee Breaks drum beat. This has got a big, dumb riff built around the 7th chord, big, dumb lyrics, and it is a glorious piece of rock and roll. Second last song is One Thing on My Mind. The vocal melodies here, I think, to Sammy's credit, are a lot better, but this song is all about Ronnie's riffing, and it's a great piece of boogie rock, much better, I think, than the one which opened this side. The last song, Make It Last, is the second of the two Hagar writing contributions to the album. Sammy's performance here and the dynamics that he exhibits, much better, much more compelling than some other places in the album. This is a real highlight for him. And of course, the other highlight is Ronnie's naked riffing at the start, just giving you all the guitar, all the heavy tone that you want, all the way through all 8 tracks in this album. To sum up this debut, you have to say that Montrose in 1973 are rocking harder than any other American band, certainly harder than Aerosmith or any of their other big-name contemporaries. It's a very good, if not great album, limited slightly, I think, by Sammy's limitations as a vocalist, and I'm not sure, listening to his later work that he did on his own or with Van Halen, that those limitations were ever that fixable. That's just kind of who he is. Technically great, melodically not so much, and the lack of dynamics normally means he falls short of people like Coverdale, Plant, or Gillan. But the worst I think you can say about Sammy here is that he's competent, and he does rise to greatness in a few songs. The real revelation on here is Ronnie Montrose's guitar. Sadly, this band's flame would burn out actually in about 6 months, but what you have here is a classic American hard rock album, a classic piece of proto-heavy metal, and for me it's 4 out of 5.